Hello and welcome to episode 440 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this March the 4th, Bill?
I'm staggered by the fact we have 40 episodes in season 4, Seth.
Indeed.
That's 42 hours. That's 80 hours of content in season 4. You people are getting for free. So it's not free to us, I'll tell you that.
You people are having
lot of work.
inflicted on you.
That's right. A lot of work goes into these 80 hours of season 4 content. My goodness.
Season 4.
I think it's more than 80 because, I mean, some of these episodes have been marathons.
Yeah, that's true. It probably is.
Yeah, we just don't know how to shut up. Anyway.
No. And obviously, the third member of our crew is with us today as well, and we're always glad to have Jon Parshall. How are you today, Jon?
I'm just peachy. I mean, the weather is cold and gray like my soul, and I'm happy to be here with my friends recording an episode. Did I say that? That came out of my mouth. Anyway.
Yeah. You did. But, hey,
no, that was your outside voice, Jon.
Yep.
Outside voice. Yeah, well, sometimes that comes out. But anyway, all right. So we have it's a different episode today, but it's incredibly important. It's very, very important to the understanding of how the Pacific War actually ended. So with that, we'll get into it. With the dropping of the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki and the massive, and I do mean massive, Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the wheels were set in motion for the end that everyone outside of Japan had longed for many years. All the world's major military powers were now aligned against Japanese interests, and the Americans had just demonstrated that they could deliver atomic ruin from the air at a pace that made a mockery of Japan's strategy to defeat an American landing on Kyushu. Armed with atomic weapons, America could now simply pulverize not only Japan's remaining cities, but her armies in the field. To any rational observer, particularly someone at 80 years removed from the events, it should have been obvious that Japan had no choice but to give up the fight and lay down her arms. Sounds easy, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, it couldn't have been more complicated, more touch and go if someone had tried to throw a wrench in the plans, and they did. The end result was a week's torturous, and I do mean torturous, deliberations within the Japanese government as increasingly hardline military men were confronted by an increasingly exasperated emperor. On several occasions, Japan's dead-enders very nearly succeeded in snatching war from the jaws of peace. But in the end, calmer heads obviously prevailed, and Japan finally announced that she would lay down her arms. Now, that sounds very simple, guys, but as you're going to see in this episode, it ain't.
It ain't. No, it was a hot mess in Japan, actually. And even though this podcast is normally not devoted to what I guess I would call diplomatic history, that's kind of what we're going into here today. Less of the boom boom, if you will, but more, what's happening in the Japanese government. And it is really, really messy at this point. Just to sort of wind it back, even before Nagasaki happens, despite the fact that, they've already had one atomic bomb dropped on them, we would think at 80 years removed that there would have been a sense of urgency within the Japanese government to now bring this war to a close, particularly after they realized that this was an atomic weapon that had been used against Hiroshima. But in fact, there was no urgency within either the Suzuki government or the emperor to actually seek peace. In fact, both men seem to have been banking at this point on Soviet diplomatic help in ending the war, which the Japanese have been seeking to no avail for several months now at this point. So at the beginning of this weeks-long thing, I feel like there's just sort of this sense of unreality that is permeating the Japanese decision makers, continued foot dragging and an unwillingness to face up to the facts on the ground and in the air at this point.
Yeah, it's good, Bill. You were going to say
something. All I was going to say is let's freeze time for a moment.
Yeah.
Hiroshima has been essentially destroyed with an atomic bomb. And as far as the Japanese government is concerned, it's like kind of business as usual. There was no agitation, no, holy cow, what just happened? We've got to make sure that we grind this thing to a close. Keep that in mind, folks, because we're going to talk about a similar reaction after the second atomic bomb. This
Right.
80 years downrange, you say, oh, this must have been the end. They must have known. Listen to what we're going to say to you.
Not at all.
Because this is what the Potsdam Declaration has happened. The Big Six is meeting. What do they say?
Yeah, essentially, we don't care, right?
Right.
I'd just like to interject a quote here from historian Herbert Bix, who wrote what is, to this point, I would say the definitive English language biography of Hirohito. And it was controversial enough in Japan that a lot of the Japanese that they banned that book for at least a certain amount of time in Japan because of what Bix was saying about Hirohito. But Bix points out here that the Suzuki cabinet and the Big Six never framed a peace maneuver from the viewpoint of saving the Japanese people from further destruction. They waited instead until their foreign enemies had created a situation that gave them a face-saving excuse to surrender in order to prevent the kokutai, which is their word for the national polity, from being destroyed by anti-military, anti-war pressure originating from the Japanese people themselves. In the final scene of the war drama, as in earlier scenes, the Japanese moderates found it easier to bow to outside pressure than to act positively on their own to end the war. So that's sort of an important nuance here, in that Hirohito and the Big Six, in many ways, are looking at unrest within the civilian population. The civilians are, in essence, the enemy of the state, potentially. And so they're not necessarily looking for a way to end the war to save the civilian population. They're looking to ways to save their own government.
That's the
Yeah, and
Japanese civilians you're talking about, John, right?
Yeah,
The Japanese government sees the Japanese civilians as the enemy
civilians.
that could drive towards a close the war. Seth?
they see it as fodder and the enemy at the same time, and we've mentioned that many times. Excuse me, over the last several episodes, and that, it was how much longer were the Japanese civilian population going to take it before they reached a breaking point because they were freaking starving. They're
Yep,
tired of being bombed.
yep,
They've been driven into the countryside in a lot of places to where, their
yep.
families are either dead or scattered. They have no jobs. They have no food. They have very little shelter. It's going to reach a breaking point at some point, no pun intended, to where the population is going to go, we've had enough, and they're going to come for these guys. I'm not saying that they're going to raise up arms and storm the palace or anything like that, but if it keeps going, you never know.
Right.
You never know.
That's
And no one
exactly
would
right.
ever storm the palace, Seth.
No, no one would
Never.
ever do
That
that.
would that would never happen,
Yeah.
Seth.
No,
Dun
no.
dun dun.
Dun, da, da. So
These are
as John was saying, August 6th obviously is Hiroshima. That's when the Enola Gay drops the bomb on Hiroshima, and August 9th is the day that Boxcar drops the weapon on Nagasaki. But there was a lot of things going on August 9th,
Yeah.
1945. It wasn't just Boxcar and Nagasaki. Halsey's Third Fleet is conducting operations off the Japanese coast. Oh, and by the way, the Soviets declare war on Japan and start doing some little things
Manchuria.
in the area of Manchuria not too long.
Right. So that news reaches Tokyo at about 0400 on the morning of the 9th. And the thing to keep in mind there is that for several days, the Japanese decision makers are not aware of the extent of the Soviet onslaught, among other things, because there's this great big force that is coming down through Mongolia that is going to be impacting the Japanese left flank in Manchuria. And those forces are so far out, in these wastelands that nobody even knows that they're there for a long time. So the the impact of the Soviet declaration of war can't be underestimated. I mean, it was certainly a major cause for concern. In particular, on the morning of the 9th, Prime Minister Suzuki runs into a Japanese officer in the bathroom of some building and asks this officer, he's an army officer, what about the Kwangtung army, and this officer says the Kwangtung army is hopeless.
Yeah.
And so that gives Suzuki an indication that this is not going to be good. And this is obviously a further negative complication as far as the Big Six are concerned.
And
But
that's
guys,
news to that. I was going to say that's news to Suzuki because I know exactly the quote you're talking about because he retorts immediately and says, "Is it that bad?"
Is it that bad? Right.
To which the officer, whomever he was, says, "Yeah, dude, it's that bad.
Yeah.
It's that bad, and
hopeless,
it's
yeah.
worse, frankly." Yeah.
Yeah, but guys, the Russian Stalin declares war. It's not like you could turn a switch and immediately attack. There's going to be a delay between when he declares war and when the operations commence. Did the
Yeah.
atomic bomb have anything to do with that timeline?
It did, absolutely. It turns out that Stalin was concerned enough by the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima that he then ends up communicating with Vasilevsky, who is the head of the general staff of the Red Army and one of the very best operators in the Red Army. Vasilevsky is the guy who's going to be in charge of this overall operation out in Manchuria. Stalin goes to him and says, "I need you to attack like basically now."
Mhm.
Because operations were intended to commence on the, let's see, he moves things up by a full week. They were supposed to happen 10 days later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not easy. You've got all those forces to supply and all of that. And just,
Right.
I think
Right.
the issue here is the Russians just wanted, kind of a dog in the fight in order
Yes.
to get their peace when the war ended.
I think
And
that's
that's the way it kind of,
absolutely right.
and
That's
that's the way it
And
absolutely
played out.
right.
and
Mhm.
I don't think, and we can get into this later if we want, but I don't think it can be argued either that Russian once it became known how bad it actually was, that also kind of kickstarted the Japanese to say, okay, all right, yeah, because there was a real threat of invasion. Well, they thought a real threat of invasion to the Kurils and the Hokkaido and all this other stuff
Okay.
that the
Yeah.
that the Soviets were potentially
Yeah.
looking at. Couldn't have
Well,
happened the next day, but it was in
Right.
the offing.
the Russians were in non-belligerence in this war until, in fact, weren't the Japanese relying on the Russians to
Yes.
help them with negotiations?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was what they were kind of banking on. But the Russians had abrogated their neutrality pact back in April, said that they were not going to renew it, and that right there, that should have been sort of the warning sign. And there were certain parties within the Japanese government are like, oh, if they're not going to renew that treaty, that's bad for us. But again, there's this sort of air of unreality within the Big Six because Togo, the foreign minister, is still up, through July, trying to pressure Sato, his ambassador in Moscow, to figure out some way to get an audience with the Russians to send a prince like Konoe out to Moscow to hopefully broker a deal. And the Russians are like, "What are your terms?"
Mhm.
And the problem for the Big Six is they can't articulate what those terms of surrender would be because there's no agreement within the Big Six as to why or as to whether they would surrender. As we sort of did in the last episode, you've got three guys, three military men who are like, we're never going to surrender. So how do you,
Mhm.
put together any sort of a decent peace mission to the Soviets if you can't even offer terms? Plus, secretly, of course, the Soviets are getting ready to stab you in the back.
Yeah,
So on that, go ahead, Bill.
all I was going to say, Seth, is this is an incredible sight picture on the day that the Nagasaki bomb is being
Right.
dropped, isn't it?
Yeah. And that doesn't happen until later in the day. But
Right.
so when it's happening, then that morning at 10 a.m., Prime Minister Suzuki is summoned to an audience with Hirohito in the palace. And at that point, Lord Privy Seal Kido, who I say is essentially the emperor's spirit animal, informs the prime minister that the war should be terminated quickly by taking advantage of the Potsdam Declaration, which we're going to be talking about here in just a little bit. So even by the morning of the 9th, even before the Nagasaki bomb has been dropped, Suzuki already has strong indications in hand that the emperor, at least, was now ready for peace. The question is, how do you make that happen?
So about a half hour later, the Big Six now they get together. They start. Suzuki starts the meeting by saying that because of the Hiroshima bomb and Soviet intervention, it was almost impossible to continue the war. Militarists have obviously demurred. We've talked about this a million times. These people can't seem to get it through their head that they're beaten.
Yeah.
and they want to continue to fight no matter what. And as you said, John, in the notes in the middle of this, oh, hey, by the way, another one of those big bombs just went off in the city of Nagasaki
Right.
and, leveled, the vast majority of that city as well. And that, as we talked about last week and the week before, is what really kind of kickstarts things in motion here right now.
Right. Although the initial reports from Nagasaki were that the bomb had been considerably less powerful than the one that had been used against Hiroshima. And so there's a little bit of misinformation there, and that it, in essence, almost strengthens the hands of the militarists because they don't initially view Nagasaki as being quite as big a deal. But nevertheless, what you can see here is that this American bluff, that we're going to drop these two bombs, boom, boom, 3 days apart, that is eventually going to pay off for us.
And it's a
So
bluff because the Japanese didn't believe we had multiple weapons.
Exactly.
And we're trying to prove to them not only do we have multiple weapons, but we're going to start a 3-day cadence.
Right.
Boom, boom, boom,
Boom,
boom.
boom.
We only had two. The next
Right.
one wasn't going to be until November. They
No,
didn't
it
know
was
that.
earlier.
no,
It was
Earlier
earlier
than
than
that.
that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's earlier than that. But
They didn't know that.
there's definitely a pause at this point.
yeah. So we talked about the Potsdam Declaration. Of course, this is the main sticking point to any at this point is the main and will be the main sticking point to any Japanese surrender because of the several of the items that are listed in the declaration. And we're not going to read the whole dang thing. If you want to read it, look it up.
Yeah.
However, there are some that need to be read because these are the ones that really stick in the craw of the Japanese. For instance, and I quote, the time has come for Japan to decide whether she will continue to be controlled by those self-willed militaristic advisors whose unintelligent calculations have brought the Empire of Japan to the threshold of annihilation, or whether she will follow the path of reason. Following are our terms. We will not deviate from them. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay. And we can go through each one of these real quickly.
Yep.
And there's only highlighted.
Yeah, i.e., there is no negotiating table to come to. This is it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Seth, I would say, as we go through this, there is not a scintilla of realpolitik in any of this, right? There's no, let's say what we need to say to get the war concluded. Because the first thing, the guys that you're calling the guys that need to agree to end the war, you start out by calling them stupid.
Idiots.
Yeah.
Idiots.
Yeah.
I gotta say, if there's any defect in anything we're going to talk about today, there's a whole bunch of things I would have changed in this his declaration. We're going to talk about more in a minute because again, the objective needs to be to get them to agree.
Right.
And generally, people don't react well when you start off by saying, "Hey,
You're an
morons."
idiot.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
So one of the other points in the declaration was, quote, there must be eliminated for all time the authority and influence of those who have deceived and misled the people of Japan into embarking on world conquest. For we insist that a new order of peace, security, and justice will be impossible until irresponsible militarism is driven from the world. And John, as you
I.e.,
put, your
your
government is
government
toast.
is toast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, and this is a shot across the bow, not only to the militarists and the people in government, but it's also directed towards the civilian population as well. I mean, it's very clear.
It is. And I got no issues with saying the government's got to be overturned, right?
Right.
We're going to come up with some other things that I'm not sure were helpful
Yeah.
in a moment.
And on that note, here we go. Until such a new order is established, and until there is convincing proof that Japan's war-making power is destroyed, points in Japanese territory to be designated by the Allies shall be occupied to secure the achievement of the basic objectives we are here setting forth.
I.e.,
Which,
you are going to be occupied, period.
yes.
Yeah. I don't really have a problem with this point either.
No.
Just making
But
it
the
clear.
Japanese do.
Yeah, the Japanese do. I get that. But again, the idea, the intent needs to be to get them to agree as quickly as possible. And this point needs to be established, I think. But you're going to come with a couple more here, Seth, that
Yes.
I don't think are helpful.
There's quite a few. The Japanese, and I quote, the Japanese military forces, after being completely disarmed, shall be permitted to return to their homes with the opportunity to lead peaceful and productive lives.
I.e., you are going to be completely disarmed and utterly helpless as a result of this. Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I agree. And again, that one needed to be said, right? You need to be disarmed, and they need to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
Here comes the next one. We do not intend that the Japanese shall, and this is important. This is hugely important because this is something that the militarists and the government believed from the get-go, that they were going to become theoretical slaves of the American nation for the rest of their lives. And it says so here.
Partly because Halsey said that, but go ahead.
We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, but stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners.
I.e., a lot of peeps is getting hanged, and probably some of the peeps that are in the room with the big six reading this very thing.
Yeah. And again, this is one of those things where if you're trying to get them to agree,
probably
you don't need to say this yet, right?
I don't know. No, we're going to argue about that at the end, but go ahead.
Yeah, because no, I agree 100% that people needed to hang, right? So no doubt about that. But hey, guys, will you agree to be hanged? I mean, there's going to be a little delay in the response, don't you think? The part about will not be enslaved. I mean, let the record show. Halsey said, when we're done with them, the only place the Japanese language will be spoken is in hell. Right.
So he was not doing us any services, that's for sure.
Not doing us any favors. So it's important to make that point. But again, and we all know, this is the realpolitik aspect of it, right? We all know people are going to get hanged. Don't make them agree to it before they agree to the peace. That's an outcome that's inevitable.
Yeah.
But don't say, yeah, you're right. We agree to be hanged. Come on. It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
The next one.
Yep.
The occupying forces of the Allies shall be withdrawn from Japan as soon as these objectives have been accomplished, and there has been established, in accordance with the freely expressed will of the Japanese people, a peacefully inclined and responsible government.
I.e., we ain't leaving until we say so. This is a completely open-ended occupation.
That's a good point.
For which the Japanese are going to benefit greatly, or at least in
the record show.
Anyway. Yeah, right.
Finally, we call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction.
That needs to be said.
Yep. So we should go ahead and have that debate now, I guess, because I think a lot of people, particularly at 80 years removed, also look at the declaration and say, "Oh my God, this is incredibly harsh." And would we not have gotten better results, out of this declaration had it been a little less harsh? But I think we have to pour ourselves into the heads of the decision makers and the Allied side at the time, all of whom had served in World War I and had seen what had happened when Germany had been allowed to be not occupied at the end of that. And they developed this whole stab in the back mythos. And Jesus Christ, 20 years later, now we have an even worse war on our hands.
Right.
At this point, every major decision maker within the Allies is like, this is what's going to happen. We are going to occupy Japan. We are going to tear their government down to the last brick, and we're going to start over. We're just not dealing with this nonsense anymore. It's absolutely non-negotiable. And so I guess I would say, as an expression of the prevailing mental mindset within the Allied decision makers, this is a very congruent expression of our intent. I grant that it's pretty damn harsh, but this is kind of where we're at the end of 4 years against these people. So
keep in mind too that we've been reading their diplomatic mail. We are complete traffic. Yes, we are completely aware that they're potentially trying, maybe thinking about peace. They're contacted the Soviet envoy and da 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 da. We know all this stuff. So it's also this is it. We're done. We're sick and tired of fighting this damn thing. And exactly to your point, and I think I'd said something like that in one of the earlier versions of these notes, is we don't want another Versailles on our hands.
Right. And we know too, I think we talked about this in the previous episode, that when Ambassador Sato in Moscow came back after the declaration is made, and he tells Togo, the foreign minister, the very best deal we are going to get out of this war is accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the added proviso that the imperial house is maintained. And which are, by the way, exactly the terms that Japan will eventually accede to. And yet, at the time that Sato sends that message to Togo, Togo comes back to him immediately and says, those terms are just absolutely unacceptable. And the Americans know this. So,
yeah, I agree with everything you said, John and Seth. The only thing I'm saying is, first, you don't start out by calling them stupid. And second, don't make them agree to be hanged as a condition of the surrender. That comes later. That's my point, right? You want to accelerate the acceptance of the surrender. So don't be stupid. And there's a little bit of stupidity in here, in my view. I'm not sure it would have made it any difference. Just because we know, with 2020 hindsight, we know the way the conversations are playing out.
Right.
And it turns out that one of those two issues became a factor in the delay, not the calling them stupid point.
Right.
But again, the objective needs to be to end the war. We knew what we were willing to accept. Let's go there and hold firm. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So the four issues that the Japanese had with the Potsdam Declaration specifically were there was no mention in the declaration of the status of the emperor. It's just like you said, John, just a second ago. They were all in agreement that the position of the emperor must be guaranteed so that the national polity or the kokutai could be preserved. The other conditions were occupation, disarmament, and war crimes trials. The Japanese stated in no uncertain terms within themselves, of course, that we will disarm our own people, we will not accept occupation by a foreign country, and will conduct our own war crimes trials.
Right.
To which, again, is that ain't happening, son.
Right.
That ain't happening.
So
but if we declare the occupation and they agree with those terms, those other things are going to happen whether they agree to them or not, right? That's kind of the way it would play out.
Maybe. But
because the pushback to that would be, but they can point to an example, the end of World War I and say, well, the Germans got away with that in 1918. Why aren't we going to get away with that in 1945? So I don't think that requirement is all explicitly understood.
I agree 100%.
Yeah. So what ends up happening then within the Big Six is you basically end up getting two camps. You've got the sort of the moderates who are Suzuki, Togo, and Yonai, who are willing to accept the declaration as long as the imperial house in some form, and understand that there's a lot of debate about just exactly what the national kokutai actually means. It's different. It's a different thing to different people. So that's the one condition camp. And then you have the other three hardliners, Anami, Umezu, and Toyota, who are in the four condition camp, that imperial house has to be maintained, no occupation, no war crimes trials, and no disarmament. So, or we'll do our own disarmament, I guess is the way to put it.
That's exactly what they were saying. And on top of that, and I found this to be just mind-blowing at this stage, Anami and Umezu specifically, like, stamped their foot and said, we have not yet been defeated. We still have fighting power left. And as I put in the notes, I can only imagine that they're talking about the army that is in China, of which there were quite a few dudes over there. But in order to make them useful, you have to be able to get them to Japan.
Yep.
And we've already proven through Bill's silent service, and Halsey's Third Fleet, roaming at will, you ain't getting those guys to Japan, or you damn sure ain't getting many of them to Japan if you do.
Yeah.
So at this point, the level of insanity that is reigning specifically in Umezu and Anami is frankly mind-boggling, and it's infuriating. If you read some of this stuff and you read the history of this conversations going back and forth, it's like you want to get up and punch a wall, because it's like, geez, God, do you not understand that you have most certainly been beaten multiple times over? You really don't have much to negotiate with at this point. It's infuriating.
Although to that end, I mean, the intel that we are getting on our end regarding the troop concentrations in Kyushu are definitely making us think twice about whether or not. Yeah. Um, would we have won? Yeah, I think so. But would the casualties have been prohibitive? Yeah, maybe so. So I do think that Anami and Umezu are within their rights to say that they still retain combat power, but whether or not it's effective combat power
Yes.
and is capable of actually achieving the strategic goals, the grand strategic goals that they are setting out for themselves, that I think is far more debatable. And yeah, they're living in la la land. I think you're right, Seth.
Big time. They're on Mars right now, man.
Mhm.
They're on Mars.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Bill.
but Japan had not been defeated in their
Ever.
entire history, right? And
Right.
so, to what extent did that weigh on these guys' minds?
And I think, and this is something that Rich Frank was just pointing out to me relatively recently, that there's a tremendous mental burden at that point. If you have this whole national mythos built on this notion that we have never been occupied or defeated in their 2,600-year-long history, think about what it means to you, Anami, and you, Umezu, that you're going to have to be the cats who are going to be the first ones in this nation's history to throw in the towel. So
Mhm.
that combined with the sort of delusional outlook on what the true military situation is means that we got some real problems here. A lot of these guys understand that if they are the ones that end up throwing in the towel, they're going to have to atone for that personally. And that's going to mean that they're either going to be hung in war crimes trials or they're probably going to have to check themselves out and commit suicide.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So, as we said, the big six is split in half, 3-3 at this stage, and the talks are not going really anywhere at this stage. So, in the palace, John, bring us
Yep.
up to state. Bring us up to the level
Yeah.
of what's going on in the palace right now.
Right. So the big six are meeting. That meeting is going to go on until about 1 p.m. But in the palace, what ends up happening is Prince Konoe, who is a big wig. He's a former prime minister himself. He was very close to the emperor and Kido. Ends up showing up in the palace, and he is aware of the one condition versus four conditions split in the Big Six, and he's concerned that what the Big Six will end up doing is sort of accepting the lowest common denominator solution to this and aiding and abetting the four conditions, and that they'll go back to the Allies and say, we need these four conditions. To Kanoe, that's crazy. He says to Kido, if we go back to the Allies and demand these four conditions, the Allies are going to look at that as a refusal to surrender. And he's absolutely right on the money on that one. And at that point, it's going to be even tougher to get a deal out of the Allies because they're going to ratchet things up even worse after that. So he urges Konoe Konoe urges Kido that we must accept the one condition clause and use that as the basis for going back to the Allies. And that seems to have persuaded Kido, which in turn is incredibly important in persuading the Emperor, because again, Kido and the Emperor are almost like Admiral Leahy and FDR were, that, Kido is the emperor's spirit animal and just understands the emperor's mind, but likewise is very influential in persuading the emperor's thinking.
So we are at an impasse right now
Yep.
within the Japanese government. And this is incredibly important to understand how things are going to play out and why things do play out the way they do because of the way the Japanese government worked in 1945.
Right.
So a full cabinet meeting had already taken place starting later in that afternoon, about
2:30
2:30.
in the afternoon.
Excuse me, with both the one condition, which is of course to keep the emperor in some sort of
In some
power,
form, right?
yeah, keep the house, and the four condition camps, which we've already discussed. We're not going to get back into that. The unwritten rule of the cabinet was that only unanimous opinions could be presented to the emperor himself. The meeting adjourned at 8 p.m. that
Five and a
evening
half hours of debate in the full cabinet, and they can't come to an agreement.
to get nowhere, to get
Mhm.
absolutely nowhere. Suzuki and Togo then headed to the palace where the emperor received them immediately. Suzuki described the impasse in his cabinet and within the Big Six. Now, and Go ahead, John. You were going to say something.
No, no, you got.
Oh, oh,
Yeah, under normal circumstances, if you've got an impasse in the cabinet of this nature, the government has to collapse. They have
correct.
to, Suzuki has to resign. We have to form a new government at this point, which, of course, in the particular circumstances of the country is in right at the moment, this is insane. We can't have that happen. So, what ends up happening is then Suzuki ends up suggesting to the emperor, let's have an imperial conference this evening, which was completely unprecedented. Normally, the emperor does not get a chance to interpose his will into these things. He sort of presides over things, but he doesn't actually ever express his opinion. And so, what Suzuki is doing here is creating an opportunity for the emperor to actually weigh in. So the emperor nods. Everyone in the room understands that this is sort of an extraordinary event. And now we've got the setup for what is going to be this climactic meeting this evening in the palace.
Bill, what happens after this? Like a little bit after 10 o'clock or a little bit before midnight on the
Right
9th.
before midnight.
Yeah, that in itself is extraordinary. 10 minutes to midnight on August 9th. The Big
Yeah.
Six and a few other senior aides filed into the Emperor's underground bomb shelter next to the library. Suzuki starts the meeting by recounting the day's meeting, the one they just had that ended at 8 p.m., and the impasse that they were having. The debate then followed in front of the Emperor, with Anami returning to the same tired argument that Japanese victory in the upcoming invasion would make the four conditions achievable. Just hold out, let them invade, we'll beat them back to the waterline, and then we'll get our four conditions and surrender. Uematsu backing him up with the assertion that the army was confident of dealing the Americans a smashing defeat on the beaches. Uematsu asserted, we cannot promise victory, but we're not yet defeated. We're aware that the war situation is difficult, but with the determination of 100 million people, many of them
Actually
children,
70.
many of them children.
Yeah.
And with further preparations, it might be possible to find life in death. Yeah, they're looking in the wrong place, guys. And this is all happening after the second atomic bomb has been dropped, folks. I want to stomp my foot on that point, right?
Yeah.
People say, oh, we didn't need to drop that second bomb.
Yeah,
They're living in la la land. Even with that bomb, these people can't get out of their own way, Seth.
The similarities between this discussion right now and what Umezu said, we cannot promise victory, but we are not yet defeated. The similarities between that and what goes on in the Führer bunker in Berlin
Mhm.
are
Amazing.
so similar. It's ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
there were guys in the Führer bunker that were like, "What are you smoking? Yeah, we're beaten. Good God, the Russians are outside."
Yeah.
And then there's other guys that are sitting there saying, "No, we can beat them back. You know, we got such and such army coming across the
Yeah.
river, and it's
Tom Cruise Steiner.
unbelievable."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
Steiner, that's it. Yeah,
Steiner.
yeah,
Yeah.
unbelievable, unbelievable. So having rehashed the arguments, yeah. Oh, and by the way, Hirohito is he's on top of the situation, as it were, because he's being informed to a degree. He doesn't know all the ins and outs, but correct me if I'm wrong, John. I mean, he does know that there is an impasse. He does know that which side leans which and all this
Yep.
other stuff, correct?
Yeah, he absolutely does.
Yeah, so he's not
Absolutely
in the
does.
dark here. He's
No.
not in the dark here at all. So they get in there and they rehash the arguments yet again. Suzuki then turns to the emperor and says, and I quote, "We have spent hours in deliberation without coming to a decision, and yet agreement is not in sight. You are fully aware that we cannot afford to waste even a minute at this juncture," unquote. So at that point, this is when Suzuki turns to Hirohito himself and says, quote, "Your Imperial Majesty's decision is requested as to which proposal should be adopted, the one stated by the foreign minister or the one containing the four conditions," unquote. So he is asking for Hirohito to weigh in, as you were saying. And the difference here is that this had only happened a handful of times. And
Yeah.
even then, it none during the war that I know of anyway.
Yeah.
And the way the Japanese government is set, and this is so vitally important, the way things shake out, is that Hirohito, people say, well, why didn't Hirohito just end the war? Because he couldn't.
Couldn't.
He could not. the way the government was set up, Hirohito couldn't just walk in the door and say, you know what, guys, we're done. We're out. Sign the accord. We're out of here. The
Yeah,
Japanese government does not work like this. Like you said just a couple minutes ago, if there is an impasse, the government breaks down, it dissolves, and then there is no peace after that. It ain't happening.
right. Yeah. So for Suzuki to directly ask the emperor for his opinion was completely unprecedented. And technically speaking, at this point, if Anami or Umezu had simply gotten up and walked out the door or
That's it.
handed
It's
in their
over.
resignations, the government, legally speaking, would have collapsed,
Mhm.
and the emperor's opinion would never have been rendered.
Mhm.
But the pace of events were fast enough at this point that neither of those two guys, I'm not sure that they were even prepared that Suzuki was going to do this in the middle of that meeting and actually ask the emperor for his opinion. Because the result is that a lot of people are like, oh my God, you know, this does not happen real frequently. As soon as he does that, the emperor immediately stands. So Suzuki recalls, without the slightest hesitation, the emperor immediately rose to his feet, and the counselors then all scrambled to follow suit because they were not ready for this either. And Hirohito then says, goes through a whole bunch of different things that are happening here. But the basis of it is I've given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad and have concluded that continuing the war means destruction for the nation and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. He went on, I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Ending the war is the only way to restore world peace and to relieve the nation from the terrible distress with which it is burdened. And Seth, there are just layers and layers of rich irony here, right? I mean,
Mhm.
what a statement for the emperor to make. You were the guy that basically
Yeah.
said the okie dokie,
Sanction this. Yeah.
sanctioned this to start with. It is your military that has been responsible for inflicting much of that bloodshed and cruelty.
Indeed.
And as we know,
And your
um,
lack of forethought has brought this suffering on your supposedly innocent people because
people,
you're a jerk. And
yeah,
that's when I put in the notes, the statement is rife with
BS.
baloney,
Yeah.
shall we say. And it's I understand he's a government figure and he's trying to get a point across, but it's like, oh my God, there's so much malarkey in that. It's he needs to bear some burden of responsibility for this because he got it to this stage, or he at least
Yep.
Mhm.
allowed it to get to this stage. And
Yep.
that's what irritated me more than anything else when I was writing the notes. I'm like, God.
Yeah. Well, and intriguingly, what Bix points out here, Herbert Bix says, is what you're seeing in essence is that the political big shots are now coming to grips with the fact that the war is going to is going to have to end, and there's already now maneuvering going on as to, okay, what's the post-war state going to look like? Because the emperor, of course, understands that at a certain level, I do bear responsibility for this thing. Geez, that's not a good position to be in. But if he can begin casting himself in a more benevolent light, that the reason I'm ending this war is because I can't bear the cruelty that is being inflicted on my
On the
innocent people.
world.
Yeah, exactly. What we're witnessing here is a mixture of, I think, both honest and dishonest motives. I do think that the emperor understood that the war had to end, but he
Sure.
is busily looking to figure out how he
Mhm.
can preserve his own neck and also the imperial house more generally.
In 2025, we would call that spin, right? So
Spin,
he's he's busy spinning, and people are going to say,
doing a little
"Oh,
spinning.
this sounds a lot like the British model, where the king in those days was is kind of above the level of the government, and the king convenes the government, approves
Yep,
but is detached. No, this guy
right,
hasn't. This has a level of nuance I want to make sure we convey here, because this guy wasn't merely the emperor; he was the god emperor, and
right.
the silly meanderings and musings of those lowly human creatures, tongue in cheek, are supposed to be below him. He's supposed to
Mhm.
hover, he's supposed to flitter above all of that. And at this
Right.
point in history, I think he's wishing he had. I think he's wishing he had been less involved, a little more flittering, a little
Yeah.
less decision making, because
Right.
then he has a deniability that he right currently at this point in history lacks.
And that is the thing that makes Bix's biography of Hirohito so controversial in Japan, is that Bix says that he didn't that Hirohito did not have direct control over the war effort, but that he sat like a spider at the middle of the web and was
Mhm.
incredibly well informed about
Yep.
what his military was doing, and at numerous occasions during the war had emphasized to the military that they needed to be aggressive and continue attacking. And so it's going to be difficult for him to have any plausible deniability about his role and his level of informativeness during the war.
Mhm.
So when he says this, when Hirohito says what we just read, it's for all intents and purposes, he's saying, I am done.
Yep.
I am done. We need to call this ball game right now. It is time to get out while we can. So upon hearing him say this, many of the guys in the room begin to openly weep. Um, Hirohito then, and I've found this to
This is
be
hugely
oh
important.
huge,
Yep.
hands out a withering dismissal of the proposed decisive land battle that Umezu and Anami have been beat again since
Bit in the wrench.
1940 freaking one, man. Been beating this dead horse for 4.5 years now. He
Mhm.
immediately shuts this down and essentially says, I have no faith in your army anymore, guys,
He doesn't say it
because
that way, though,
everything.
Seth.
No, he
He
doesn't. He
says
does not.
very nuanced, very subtle, but it's no less a stab to the gut.
Oh yeah, he says, and I quote, he says Hirohito says there has always been discrepancy between plans and performance. Given this, how can we repel the invaders? In other words, yeah, you talk a big game, but you've yet to back it up.
Mhm.
Right. At which point, yeah, Anami and Umezu must have just felt like dying at this point,
Yeah.
because
Well,
we have to understand too that the Japanese language is extremely subtle, and they're extremely oblique in how they approach things. They never really call it in anybody's face, and yet the way
It's
that he
true in
phrased
business
it
too in Japan,
is true.
John.
I mean, you never
You never know what they're thinking.
you never know. I know. Having lived there, that's just kind of how it rolls. So for the emperor to have pointed out that discrepancy between plans and performance, that is, as close as an emperor can actually come to saying BS. And so
Mhm.
yeah, he just completely shuts the military down at this point.
but he ain't done. So
No.
he continues to speak on about how much it pained him to think of those who had served so faithfully, those killed in battles and the air raids as well. He then said, and I quote, "It goes without saying that it is unbearable for me to see the brave and loyal fighting men of Japan be disarmed. It is equally unbearable that others who have rendered me devoted service should now be punished as instigators of war.
Ooh.
Nevertheless, yeah, nevertheless, the time has come to bear the unbearable. Remember those words. When I recall the feeling of my imperial grandeur, the Emperor
Grandsire.
Meiji,
Yeah.
grandsire, the Emperor Meiji, I swallow my own tears and give my sanction to the proposal. Swallow my own tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation on the basis outlined by the foreign minister, unquote. And
Yep.
at that, he gets up, turns around, drops the mic, and walks out the room.
Walks out of the room.
Yeah.
Um,
So the underline that line where he says it's equally unbearable that others who have rendered me devoted service should now be punished.
yes,
Yes.
i.e.,
Instigators of war.
I'm throwing you under the rug.
You are thrown under the bus, dudes.
Under the bus. Yep.
Yeah. So when he turns around and walks out, I mean, that's it. The meeting is essentially over. Yeah,
He's not allowing any additional debate on this thing.
yeah, that's it. We're
No.
done. We're
We're
done
done.
here. Suzuki says, and I quote, His Majesty's decision should be made the decision of this conference as well, unquote. And the Suzuki gets what he wanted. That's why he
Yep.
brought Hirohito in there in the first place. So it was quite a shrewd move by Suzuki,
Yeah.
frankly.
Mhm.
So, as I said just a few minutes ago, we had been monitoring Japanese diplomatic talks for weeks. We'd been listening to the radios in Tokyo for any sort of
In, Indications as to
breadcrumb that
yeah,
something's going to
what's going
happen.
on.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So and nothing is really shaken in the leaves right now, so to speak. So the transmission of the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration with one condition was decrypted on the 10th of August while it was being sent to Switzerland. The formal message was received by the United States later that day via the Swiss embassy. So the Japanese, as soon as Suzuki ends this meeting, he and his boys immediately start going to draft some sort of paperwork.
Yep.
So, John, let's get into the Big Six's interpretation of the one condition
Yeah, and we don't need
acceptance.
to belabor that, but the bottom line is that there is a difference of opinion within several members of the Big Six. Is okay, when we say the preservation of the imperial house, are we just saying that the institution of the emperor is going to be preserved, and we don't necessarily care about who that emperor is, or are we in fact talking about the preservation of Hirohito's rule? And as you can imagine, Hirohito would like it to be the latter. Um, so this makes it complex for the Americans too when their linguists are trying to grapple with the Japanese response and saying we require the preservation of the kokutai. Well, what the hell does the kokutai actually mean if you're an American? Because the Japanese themselves can't even really agree on what the kokutai means. All of the Americans know is okay, the imperial house has to be preserved in some form. That's what the Japanese are asking for. But it's kind of unclear as to what that's going to be. And the real kicker here is that the hardliner interpretation of Kokutai also means that in their minds, okay, even if we're occupied, the emperor is still going to be in charge, right? That the act of creating the state, the Kokutai, is coincident with the enlightened rule of the emperor under state Shinto, and therefore, just because we're accepting this with one condition doesn't mean that the emperor's rule is necessarily going to be subject to any sort of prerogatives on the part of the allies.
So when, go ahead, Bill.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, this is not going to, the confusion is going to fan the flames on the
It gets
American
worse.
side, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Yeah, it gets worse. So when we get this message, and when we interpret this message as best we can, a lot of people under Truman's government said, "Nah, nah, we should not accept this. You should
Right.
immediately reject this and kick this back." But no surprise to us, one of the men that said, "Nah, let's think about it for a minute," is Admiral William Leahy. He says to Truman, you should take this. You should take this, and you should take this now." Um, it could not be seen, and this is incredibly important, though, the response the Americans will give to this could not be seen to collapsing or accepting any kind of Japanese demands. So you could still have that unconditional surrender, but you
We
had to
have to be in the
play
driver's
the
seat.
word game here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we whatever our response is, we have to be seen as the ones who are actually defining what these terms end up meaning. And of course, there's an additional complication here too, that any modification to this declaration, it's not just the Americans' call. We have
Correct.
to,
It's the Allies.
yeah, we got to get approval
Mhm.
from the Brits and the Chinese and also the Russians as to this thing. And they can all look at this and say, what do you mean? We demanded unconditional surrender from Germany, and that's exactly what we got. They put pen to
Why should
paper,
it be
and
less?
why
Yeah.
should it be less for the Japanese? So
Mhm.
anyway,
There's big differences as to why there should be less. Not the least of which is that we had boots on the ground in Berlin
right,
at that time,
exactly. And
Right.
we
where
don't
we don't
have
have
that.
them
And
in Tokyo right now.
no,
Yeah.
and the prospects of getting them there are becoming increasingly grim.
Indeed. So
Correct.
Leahy says, and I quote, he says, "I had no feelings about little Hirohito, but was convinced that it would be necessary to use him in effecting the surrender." We did an episode on Leahy. The man was freaking brilliant. He, honest to
Yep,
God, was. Henry Stimson agreed with Leahy and suggested that the United States should act quickly because the Soviet impact against Japan was expanding quite literally by the hour.
yep,
Stimson felt, and he was 100% correct, that the future of Asia depended on how quickly the United States acted on the Japanese proposition. At this stage, the U.S., like Japan had been earlier, was at an impasse within the government. And Bill, it's Seknev Forstall who breaks that impasse, doesn't it?
He does. The guy had a little knack for nuance and how to say something without actually saying it. So he makes a suggestion that wins the day. The Allies need not accept or reject the Japanese proposition at all. What we can do is simply make an affirmative statement. In other words, we'll declare what we think we heard, and let them dispute it. Right? This is brilliant. It really is. A lot of good lawyers learn this method. Such a statement would essentially ignore the Japanese condition while simultaneously assuring the Japanese that Hirohito would be left alone on the throne. Toss them a bone without acknowledging the fact that they didn't accept the terms, technically, right? So Secretary of State Burns, aided by Leahy and Secretary of War Stimson, and with Truman's approval, then craft a masterful response. Very simple. Unlike the earlier communication that had way too many words, words, like Mozart's symphonies. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the governor, in other words,
The emperor.
that's
The emperor.
the emperor. I'm sorry, the emperor. That's a de facto implication that the emperor would survive without saying it. The authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the surrender terms. So, guys, this is brilliant, but does it work?
Eventually.
Eh.
The basically what's happening here, again, as Rich Frank points out, that the American response intentionally implied much, but firmly promised nothing. So,
Well, it says that the emperor, he'll be there,
yeah,
but he's only going to be allowed to do what the Supreme Allied Commander allows him to do for all
Right.
intents and
Correct.
purposes. And
That's
of course,
right.
we know who that is. That's Mac.
in
But
essence, what we're doing here is we're creating an American shogun. That
Correct.
the emperor will still be nominally the emperor, but the real shots are going to be called by Supreme Allied Commander, which is Mac.
Hey, it's an ancient Japanese model. Why wouldn't it work?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the response, the American response, went on further, and it said that the ultimate Japanese government must be democratically elected. No surprise here, and that the Allied occupation would continue until such time as the Potsdam terms were fulfilled. In other words, as Rich says, we're gonna give you a little bit of a bite on the hook there, but we're not going to give you everything. Um, this is strictly a political move by Truman, in my opinion. I just,
How do you mean that?
Well, so the fact that he sits there and does,
You,
go ahead, Bill.
you mean internal politics, right?
Yes.
An American political move. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because everything is a political move by the president. All right.
Right. Well, of course, yeah. Every time he goes to the bathroom, it's a political move.
Mhm.
But point being is that Truman is also looking at the fact that he's going to have to be reelected, and he wants to end this war. And the American people want to end this war. And he's going to do whatever he needs to do to end this war, even if it means by accepting unconditional surrender to get the war over with, which is in the right move, obviously. But Truman is trying to save his political neck in the future. And that's what I'm trying to say by it.
Okay, I got you.
That's what I
Yeah, I
feel.
mean, essentially what we're doing here is giving them conditional, unconditional surrender.
Correct.
Exactly.
Correct. And he's allowing it to happen. So,
Yeah.
all right. So the American reply to the one condition is broadcast to Tokyo by commercial radio in the United States on the 12th of August. Togo mulled the American reply over and felt that it was not ideal, but it was acceptable. While the emperor must be subservient to MacArthur, who was going to be the
Isn't
Supreme
everybody?
Allied Commander,
Isn't everyone? Exactly.
at least he would remain on the throne. But other Japanese who had been on the peace train now began to waffle over the American response, and for a while it looked like peace might yet again slip away.
Right.
Mhm.
So back in Tokyo, while the Americans are mulling on their response, things are still happening in Tokyo, and among other things, the emperor is making sure to shore up internal support within his own family and also within the former prime ministers that are still living within Japan, who are also often what I want to say, accessed for these sorts of decisions because they're seen as being, wise dudes, and so we want them on board as well. The family dynamics here with the imperial family are really interesting because Hirohito is the older of four brothers, and the next oldest, Prince Chichibu, was a notorious right-wing hardliner who actually, when there had been a coup attempt back in the 20s, Chichibu was clearly on board with the notion of installing a military dictatorship. And so Hirohito understands that any of those other three brothers could potentially be used as a front man by a military coup to oust Hirohito and put, Chichibu or somebody else on the throne. One thing Hirohito had going for him is the Chichibu was very ill with tuberculosis that would eventually kill him after the war. And so Chichibu is actually convalescing at his own mansion, near Mount Fuji. He's kind of out of the picture. But he makes sure to have his other two younger brothers, Takamatsu and Mikasa, over to the palace and say, my boys, this is what's happening here. We're going to surrender. And the reason we're going to surrender, by the way, is because I have absolutely no faith in the military's ability to repel an invasion at this point. So he sticks a fork in the military again. The other thing that he does is that he has audiences with all of the remaining living prime ministers, including Tojo, and says the same thing. Some of them, like Tojo, hint that, yeah, well, I don't think that the army is necessarily going to accept that. So, i.e., subtly get ready for a coup. But most of the prime ministers do fall in line with the emperor's opinion.
And that was something that Umezu and Anami had laid a very thinly veiled threat numerous times before any of this occurred, that we don't know if we can get the army to accept any of these kind of terms.
Yeah.
There are still a lot of guys in China. There's still guys in the Pacific, here and there. We don't know if we can get them, and obviously the home islands, we don't know if we can get these people to lay down their arms and surrender, which was a thinly veiled threat at a possible military coup,
Yep.
which we're going to see actually does occur.
Happen.
Mhm.
So go ahead, Bill.
No, I was agreeing with you, Seth.
Oh, so the army at the same time is basically just eating itself alive, right, John?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got when Anami walks into the army ministry and announces to these various officers that we are going to surrender, and not only that, but I'm going to back the emperor up on that. There's just a lot of gnashing of teeth here, as you can understand, and you see here Anami kind of waffling back and forth because. Um, Anami asks Suzuki at one point whether he would continue the war if the Allies balked at the one condition proposal, and Suzuki astonishingly says that he would vote to continue the war if that were the case. Um, at which point, when Togo, the foreign minister, finds out, he rounds on Suzuki and is like, "What are you doing? You need to be on the peace train here because the emperor has said that that is what he wants to do." So Togo upbraids him. Kido ends up upbraiding him as well, and eventually Suzuki falls back into line. But yeah, the situation with the army at this point is really, really touch and go. The other
That
sort
could
of
have.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was going to say that could have had fatal results.
Yeah,
Suzuki's waffling on the line, because if that gets through to other members of the Army General Staff, and they're
right.
like, "Oh, wait a minute, we got somebody who's maybe coming to our side,"
Who
that could have
knows?
been, yeah,
Yeah,
that could have been absolutely horrendous,
really
absolutely
bad.
horrendous. So go ahead, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Meanwhile, you got Admiral Yonai, who is a very perceptive customer, and he makes the comment around the same time that, in effect, the atomic bombs could be considered, and the Soviet invasion as well, as tenyu, or gifts from the gods, and that they gave the Japanese government a face-saving option to quit the war before domestic circumstances, which he viewed as dire, forced an end to it anyway. And I think he's absolutely correct in this, that qualitatively speaking, the bombs were just a total game changer. That again, it made perfect sense that 1,000 airplanes over the course of an evening can reduce a city to ashes. The fact that one plane with one bomb can do it in an eye blink that's just unsupportable. We are up against a super weapon here that we just can't get past, but that gives us a face-saving out to just get out of this thing at this point and flip the table and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bill, the coup that had been threatened several times was a very real possibility within the army at this point, wasn't it?
It is, and there's still a lot of fog about to what extent the senior folks were played in on this. Um, but there were plenty of people willing to engage here, which is shocking. That said, within the military ranks, specifically the army, the threat that Anami had spoken of, which is that coup, was still a very real possibility. General Kawabe Toshiro, deputy chief of the Imperial Japanese Army staff, vowed to do his utmost to persuade the army to lay down its arms. Kawabe was racked with guilt, humiliated, but above all, he admitted that the emperor's view of the war was accurate. He couldn't argue with it. The army could never defeat the Americans, not at this point. And as we probably knew, it was inevitable that they would be at this point in history. He felt that at that time he must do whatever it was in his power to preserve the very fragile peace that had, as of yet, not been officially signed or even transmitted to the Americans. Members of the Big Six wanted to send another message to the U.S. asking for clarification. Let's delay, let's deny, let's obfuscate. Togo countered that, and he was right about this, any such message would more than likely be seen as a rupture in negotiations and break the deal. Umezu and Toyota sent a letter to the emperor, which was not something they should ever have done, but they did it anyway. At this point, they just don't care. That letter said that the acceptance of the American proposal might lead to a situation that cannot be controlled and reduce Japan to a vassal state that we should never accept. In other words, they were afraid that the United States was going to do to Japan what Japan had done to a whole bunch of other countries.
Everybody else.
Korea, Indochina,
Yep.
To some extent China, Taiwan, the Formosa, and all that, right? So insanity. This is insanity. I mean, the fact that they're still debating this stuff is just crazy. On the 12th and 13th, with the Burns response now in hand, the cabinet and the Big Six went roundy round over whether to accept it and could come to no agreement. In the cabinet, 15 ministers, this is the full cabinet we're talking about, were in favor of accepting. The 3 members, you can guess which 3, the same 3 in the Big Six, and one was against it. And there was one that was undecided. Again, there was a very real possibility here of the entire government collapsing, the can being kicked, months potentially. All Anami had to do was hand in his resignation, and the Suzuki government would fall. So he must have really been on board, guys, right?
Yeah, we'll never really know that, will we? Anyway.
Yeah. So and it's important to note too that we had actually, under Truman's order, had stopped bombing Japan for a few days.
Mm-hmm.
As we're monitoring all of this, now obviously we don't know what's being said within the palace. We don't know what's being said within the cabinet, but we got a pretty decent idea what the hell's going on. At this point, on the 14th of August, Truman says, "That's it, go, bring it." And we resume bombing Japan again. Several targets are bombed by the 20th Air Force. Halsey's Third Fleet's out there conducting operations yet again. John, you put in this particular action here, we start dropping a lot of leaflets as well as bombs in these missions too.
So this is where we sort of twist the knife, because now having transmitted our response, the Burns response, back to the Japanese government, that here's our definition of what the one condition means. We then put the full response of the Burns proposal in these leaflets, and we're dumping millions of these things all over the major cities in Japan. Which means now that what we've done is we've ripped the veil of secrecy off of the Japanese government's deliberations, and now the common man and woman on the street are going to have an understanding as to what's going on. So that ends up happening very early on the morning of the 14th, like 0100 or whatever. The very next morning, when normal people wake up, Privy Seal Keto gets one of these, pamphlets put in his hand, one of these leaflets, and immediately understands the implications that the jig is up at this point. That now that the common man and woman understand what is going on here, we absolutely have got to, bring an affirmative close to this thing and tell the Americans we give up. And so he immediately goes to the emperor, and the emperor then turns around and summons Suzuki to the palace. And because everybody understands that time is now absolutely critical, that we can't give the army any operating room here. We need to bring this thing to a close this morning.
And you can't give the people any more excuse to get pissed off.
Right.
Because that indicate that the fact that he gets that note thrown in his hand, that leaflet thrown in his hand, and immediately, goes to fetch his brown pants.
Yeah.
He knows that it is over with now, because if these, million odd, however many people are left in Tokyo at this stage, start to get wind of this, they're going to hold certain people responsible, and we're going to have a problem. So that whole threat of a civilian uprising is proven right here, that they were very, very, very aware of the possibility of this.
It ratchets up, right?
Big time. Big time. So at 10:20 that morning, the emperor yet again assembles all of his military men, including the distinguished and highly respected Field Marshal Hata Shunoroku, who had just returned from Hiroshima that morning. Hata was commander of the Second General Army in charge of Operation Ketsugo, which, of course, is the decisive battle, if you will.
Hata is a big shot. Yeah.
So dish on Hata here for us.
Yeah, I mean he's an extremely senior guy. He's been around the block, and he is the dude that basically Anami and Umezu are hanging their hopes on, that this guy is going to be the one who's going to kick the Americans back into the water. So when he shows up to this meeting, the expectation by the rest of the army men in this is that Hata is going to back up Anami and Umezu and say that we don't need to give up, that we can repel the Americans and blah, 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 blah. And that's exactly what he does not do. Instead, he turns around and tells the assembled there that he has no confidence in repelling an American invasion, and that he supports the emperor's decision, which is a total gut punch to the rest of the army guys that are standing there. At which point, the emperor, who has been presiding over this, this second imperial conference, if you will, says that the Soviet intervention and the enemy's scientific power could not be checked even with special attack tactics, and directly requested that his field marshals and admirals cooperate with him to end the war. This is tantamount to an order. So just a few minutes after that, Hirohito reassembles the full cabinet. Suzuki asks Zanami, Umezu, and Toyota again to state their case. Briefly and full of emotion, they do so. Hirohito is iron-willed, though, at this point. He makes no bones about accepting the proposal and immediately countermands the hardliners with the following: I have listened carefully to the arguments presented, but my own thoughts have not undergone any change, and it is my belief that a continuation of the war promises nothing but additional destruction. I have studied the terms of the Allied reply and have concluded that they constitute a virtually complete acknowledgement of the position we maintained. In short, I consider them acceptable.
That's him saying, yet again,
game over.
I'm done.
Yes.
Yeah. And those special tactics he referred to meant suicide tactics, right? So he's saying, even if we have, basically charge everybody to suicide attack, we're still going to lose.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's all sorts of crazy proposals going around at this point in time. Admiral Onishi, who was the sort of the father of the kamikaze effort in this day's period, walked into the army ministry and said, "Let us formulate a certain path to victory. That if we can sacrifice 20 million people, charging at the enemy, that we will undeniably gain victory." It's just like, you people are insane, and you keep going around and around on the same stuff. Anyway.
Yeah. So the audience is again reduced to tears. The emperor orders an imperial rescript be created so that he could broadcast to the Japanese people which, by the way, had never been done before, which
Right.
he would do the very next day. So the foreign minister began transmitting Japan's acceptance of the Burns proposal to Switzerland. Washington obviously receives the semi-official word at 0249 via a Dome shortwave news report. It's all over, right?
Nope.
No.
No.
No, it's not.
No, it is not. Bill, take it.
Mm.
So even after the second upbraiding, Seth, from the Emperor, Anami at least was still not fully convinced. I mean, you got the 2x4 hadn't hit him in the head yet. He
Yeah.
asked Umetsu shortly afterwards whether the war should be continued, even at the risk of a coup. Umetsu finally responded sensibly, "No, it is impossible, because the decision of His Majesty has already been given." Shortly afterwards, Anami then ran to his own brother-in-law, bounced similar notions. He's going to keep going to people until he gets the answer he
It's
wants,
the answer it wants, right?
only to be rebuffed again that the decision to continue fighting was absolutely mistaken. Later that day, in a meeting of the very most senior men, Unami Umetsu Hata, Field Marshal Sugiyama,
Sugiyama, another big
Inspector
shot.
General Doihara, it was agreed that they should all sign a document pledging support to the emperor's decision. To the last, it's after some discussion, this was done. And further signatures were gathered from the head of Japan's Air General Army, Masakatsu Kawabe. So everybody signs. It would seem now that the formal support of the Army's senior officers was in hand. So a coup would be much less likely, right? Wrong. There was also a long tradition in the Imperial Army of what was called Gekokujo.
Yep.
Did I say that right?
Yep. Gekokujo.
Gekokujo,
Yep.
which means leadership from below. And you're gonna
And
you
my
argue
comment
that this
there
isn't
is that
true.
if it's
Go ahead.
not real Gekugujo, it's just sparkling insubordination. I mean, that's what we would call it in other armies, and we would hang their practitioners. But there had been this long tradition in the Japanese army. I mean, you look at things like the Mukden incident, that was kicked off by a bunch of officers in the Kwantung army who were way over their pay grade in ordering operations like that. But there had been
Mhm.
a steady string of political assassinations that had occurred during the 20s and 30s, all done by lower rank officers, captains, majors, that kind of ilk, who were looking to keep the government as hardline as possible. And that's exactly what's going to happen here.
Up to the point of there's a whole bunch of dead Japanese prime ministers, right? Through
Yep.
these Gekokujo. I'm going to stop
Yep.
trying to say that. There
Yeah,
was
it's a
a
hard one.
cabal. Yeah, there was a cabal of younger officers in Tokyo who felt that the emperor's position was insupportable and were determined to replace Hirohito, yes, you heard that right, with a military government bent on waging war to the end. Several of these had a direct contract with Anami, the guy who's kind of going around asking all the questions. This isn't right. Can't we still fight the war? During the 12th and the 13th. And one of them was Anami's right hand man, Colonel Arao Okikatsu. On the night of the 14th, though, now knowing that the emperor had recorded a rescript, he recorded this audio recording that was going to be played over the radio to the entire population of Japan, and that he intended to surrender the very next day. The conspirators panicked and decided they needed to strike that very night, Seth.
Yep.
So after failing to convince the leader of the Imperial Guard Division, General Mori Takeshi, to join the coup, they killed him.
Yep.
They just straight up murdered him. Orders forged with his seal and further authenticated with the seal of Colonel Arao. In other words, they're trying to get into the palace grounds here, and they're doing
Yep.
whatever they can, which includes murder, to do that very thing. One group of officers then went to first to Prime Minister Suzuki's office, then his house to kill him.
Yep.
But Suzuki had been warned and he escaped. If I remember correctly, he jumped out of a window in his bathrobe and went running down the damn street.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So shortly thereafter, troops from the Imperial Guards entered the palace grounds looking for the recording. The Emperor watched all of this through armored shutters of his own quarters, so he knows what is going down or what is about to go down
Yep.
anyway. The Imperial Guardsmen searched for hours, unaware that the recordings, along with the Kido and the Imperial Household Minister, were hiding in what was called the bank vault under the palace, John.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we should pause here just to say the Imperial Palace is enormous.
Yeah, it's big.
It's big. If you go to Tokyo and just drive around it, it takes a while. It's a big chunk of real estate, so it's not like you can
Mm.
just search this place in 30 or
Knock
40
on the
minutes.
front door. Yeah,
No,
it's not like the White House. It's
yeah,
just way bigger.
yeah. So, yeah, it really is a pretty formidable structure. Yeah, but the bottom line is that they couldn't find this stuff. And finally, what ends up happening in the morning is a guy named Tanaka Shizuichi, who was the former commander of the Imperial Guards himself and another very senior man in the military, in the army, gets wind of the fact that there's this coup going on, immediately gets additional troops dispatched to the palace to take on the guard if need be, and then hops in a car and goes over to the palace himself solo and walks into the palace, berates the officers in charge of this coup, and essentially shuts down the coup right then and there. There's some bizarre sort of incidents that then go on where some of the coup leaders are driving through the streets of Tokyo, throwing leaflets around, support our position or whatever. But the inevitable result is, of course, that they have to kill themselves, and they do. But the coup now is over with. The sort of haunting question becomes, what was Anami's role in this, if any? And we will never know because Anami kills himself at this point. Right before the Emperor is supposed to go on and surrender, Anami ends up killing himself in his house. And next to his body, there are found two scrolls with, poems of his or whatnot. And one of them says, believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime. What was the great crime?
Yeah.
Is that an allusion to Anami's role in some respect to the coup? We won't know, but the bottom line is that a lot of post-war Japanese historians look at this and they say that the coup was not the fleeting dream of some few young officers, but a plan in which some central figures in the army were participants, and the most
Mm.
likely culprit would have been Anami.
I
Yep.
don't think that's arguable. I mean, the man had been threatening it
Yeah,
from the get-go in thinly veiled threats, which I mean, a blind man could see what he was trying to allude to here.
yeah,
Looking for
I don't think there's,
supporters. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I think
yeah,
even if he didn't order it, he knew the great crime that he's apologizing for is he didn't do anything to stop it.
anything to stop
He
it.
knew about it, right? And
Complicity. Yeah.
yeah.
right. So at noon on the 15th of August, 1945, Hirohito's recorded message to his people was broadcast. And I mean broadcast. It was literally broadcast everywhere, not just on the radio and like people's houses, but they brought trucks up with loudspeakers, the whole
The
shebang.
whole shebang.
They
Mm.
wanted everybody to hear this. And I think it was like the afternoon before, so it would have been the afternoon of the 14th. They said, keep your radios on through the night because there's going to be a big announcement the next day at noon.
Didn't know that.
And yeah, it was like, be ready because we're about to say something at noon the next day. So be aware. And I quote, some of the address goes like this: after 4 years of, these are Hirohito's words. After 4 years of war, despite the valiant efforts of our land and naval forces, the diligence of our government officials, and the devoted service of our 100 million subjects, the war situation has not necessarily turned in Japan's favor. Moreover, the general trends of the world have not been advantageous to us. Furthermore, the enemy has begun to employ a new and cruel bomb, causing immense and indiscriminate destruction, the extent of which is beyond all estimation. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of the human civilization. This is why I have ordered the Empire to accept the terms of the joint declaration. There's a lot in there that we can discuss
There's a
here in a minute.
lot to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Total
fluff in
for
there.
my money, that is one of the most classic understatements in the history of the world. You know, the
You
war
think?
situation has not necessarily developed in Japan's favor. I just
But
love that one.
combined with a classic overstatement, it would lead to the total extinction of the human civilization. In other words, I'm doing this for humanity.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm doing this as a favor
Yeah.
to you guys.
It
Right.
would
And
total
the
extinction of the
argument that
Japanese
Herbert,
population.
right.
Yeah.
Herbert Bix makes the argument, I think it's absolutely right, that what's going on here is that the emperor is using this occasion to begin his own personal reinvention as a pacifist, anti-militarist, and completely passive onlooker in the war, none of which he had actually been. It creates an air of benevolence about it, and completely sidesteps his own heavy responsibility for what had been going on. The other thing that's sort of interesting about this address is that a lot of the Japanese people couldn't even really understand the guy.
Correct. Yep. Yeah.
He's speaking in this archaic court speak, and the lesser educated Japanese are like, I don't even know what he's saying, but I can kind of get the gist of the message that, we're done.
Yeah, that's pretty much what goes on. Is most of them can't understand, and even some of the higher educated guys, even like college professors, are sitting there going, "What?"
What?
But the way that people are reacting, a lot of them are weeping, and people are starting to get the idea. It's like, yeah, I think this thing's over with, finally.
Yeah.
So you said, John, that was the intent of the whole thing here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that he is trying to reinvent himself in this way, cast this air of benevolence, despite the fact that he and his government have been dragging their feet frankly, for months at this point.
Yes.
There were any number of opportunities earlier in 1945 when the Japanese government could have gotten serious about putting peace feelers out there.
So
Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, but he also downplays the Soviet invasion of
Yes.
Manchuria very, very heavily. He just kind of breezes
Yeah, it
over.
does. I mean, that's sort of alluded to when he says that the general trends of the world have not been advantageous to us, i.e., there's this great big, invasion going on in Manchuria. Um, there's a lot of debate, of course, in scholarly circles as to whether the bomb was the most important factor or Soviet invasion was the most important factor in terminating the war. I am strongly in the bomb camp myself.
Okay.
And to me, the fact that the emperor explicitly addresses a new and most cruel bomb is there's the primary source material that tells you that it's the emperor who thinks that it's the bomb that's number one. On the other
And
hand, there's a subsequent address though that is only sent to the army in China, which talks mostly about the Russian invasion as being the real issue here. But then again, they were sort of on the receiving end of this invasion themselves. So yeah, it's really hard to parse.
Well, an internal conversation. I mean, he said that we can't fight America's science or something like that, right? So that's
Yes.
more reflection of it was the bomb.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Again,
So
just from a qualitative standpoint, the bomb just flips the table. It's just
It does.
nothing like anybody's ever been able to deal with before. Go ahead, Seth.
so I was going to say in the United States, the speech that Hirohito gives is put in newspapers. Many citizens in this country felt that the overall tone of Hirohito's message was self-righteous and defiant, and to a degree, it kind of was.
Yeah.
Still at sea, Third Fleet strikers were en route to Honshu targets when word reached them of the Japanese surrender. Dropping their ordnance in the ocean, the aviators turned for home. Aboard USS Missouri, Admiral William Halsey ordered signal flags run up the mast. Her siren wailed for 1 full minute and her whistle blasted continuously. Finally, this war is over, gentlemen.
Yes. And yet we have one little denouement that I know Seth and I have both been looking forward to.
Indeed.
One of
Indeed.
our continuing Japanese dramatis personae will now shuffle himself off the stage.
Indeed. And we have to because we've talked about him throughout this entire series.
All
And when we
yes,
continue to talk about Pearl Harbor and all that other next season, we're going to talk about him again. But this is the fitting place to discuss his demise. And that, of course, is the death of the poetic tool.
yes.
Japanese
Yeah,
Admiral.
if you don't know who we're talking about, go back about 2 months worth of episodes, and
Yeah.
you'll hear a lot about him.
Yeah. So Japanese Admiral Ugaki Matome is, as I said, he's been a recurring figure throughout this series because of his diary. He heard the quote, hateful news of the surrender at his Fifth Air Fleet headquarters on Kyushu, and initially refused to believe what he'd heard. Calling combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo, he received the confirmation that he absolutely did not
No.
want to hear. No.
Mhm.
On the same day that everyone else listened to Hirohito's address, so did Ugaki upon receiving the news, which he said he barely heard due to a bad radio, and I completely believe that. He wrote, and I quote, as one of the officers the throne trusted, I met this sad day. I've never been so ashamed of myself, alas. So he had been, and again, if you read the diary, even if you don't read it cover to cover, which is a very difficult thing to do,
Yeah, it is.
if you if you read certain historical high points by date, you get the impression that Ugaki was fascinated and just overcome with emotion anytime a Japanese serviceman sacrificed himself
He
in
loved
any way,
that.
shape, or form. Yeah,
Yeah,
in
he
any way,
thought that
shape, or
was
form. You know, he heaps praise on the midget submariners in the Pearl Harbor raid. He thinks that the Special Attack Force hung the moon. And he is very into this whole suicidal thing. So he, no surprise here, decides that he too is going to commit suicide. But John, he's going to commit suicide like, he
why
ordered
just
tens of thousands of other guys to do.
yeah, why just kill yourself when you can kill some other guys along with you? I mean, that's
Sure. Yeah.
basically where he comes down with. And since he is uh, a big wig at Fifth Air Fleet, he not coincidentally also has access to combat aircraft and the aviators to fly them.
As he said in his diary, and I quote, we haven't received the ceasefire order. Yeah, you did. So there is no room for me to reconsider. I'm going to follow in the footsteps of those many loyal officers and men who devoted themselves to the country, and I want to live in the noble spirit of the special attack, which means, of course, obviously, he's going to fly or at least ride in a bird and crash himself into an Allied ship. So, roughly at 1600 on the 15th of August, after the address had been issued, Ugaki drank a final farewell toast of sake, then was driven to Oita Airfield where he waited for his last flight. There's a couple pictures of this too. He's just like
Yeah,
sitting in like a lawn chair, just
right.
hanging out.
Chilling out.
Yeah. He strips his uniform of all insignia. He carries his short sword that was given to him by Yamamoto, which is pretty cool. Sitting in the rear cockpit of a Judy dive bomber, Ugaki appeared calm and serene in the last picture taken of him, which I will show here. Apparently, the radioman who normally sat in the seat begged to go along with the admiral, who squeezed the man in front of him in the rear cockpit. And there, again, you can barely see the guy, but there's another cat like sitting by his knees in the
Right.
cockpit of this damn thing. And John, as you say, a
Yeah.
tool to the last.
Cool
A
to the
normal
last.
human
Yes.
being would have said, "There's no reason for you to die to get out of here.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to
Yeah.
do that." He was
No.
not a normal human being. Sure, you want to die for no good reason? Come on,
Come on.
I'll
Yeah.
bring you with me. Squeeze in the cockpit next to my feet.
That's going to be
Yeah.
a
So
bumpy ride. Yeah.
not only do you die without your dignity because you're
Right.
sitting there next to my feet.
Yeah. So 11 aircraft taxi out to conduct this last kamikaze run. 3 later returned with engine malfunctions, engine troubles. Uh, Smartest guys in the air that day, dude.
That's right.
Gee, I'd really like to pointlessly kill myself, but my magneto started acting funny and I had to come home.
Yep. Mhm.
Yep.
Smartest guys in the air that day. At 1924, that same day, Ugaki's plane radioed that they were crashing the arrogant American ships off Okinawa, and they were never heard from again.
Yeah.
So USN United States Navy reports later said that a handful of Japanese aircraft did indeed attack ships off Yashima. All of them were shot down by AAA. No American ships were hit and no casualties were sustained. The following day, LST-926 reportedly found the remnants of a cockpit with 3 men inside. One was wearing a dark green uniform and carrying a short sword. This was assumedly Ugaki.
And this is on an island, though, or something like that, that they
It's
find the
right
remains of
like
this
on the
plane.
on the
Yeah,
shore, right there by the
He was
beach.
on
Yep.
land,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I did a little digging into this, and apparently the flight, or what makes it to that area, a lot of them, I say a lot, like half, six, broadcast that they were going to attack targets on land as well.
Oh, interesting.
They were
Okay.
going to into a hangar, or, who the hell knows?
Right.
A vehicle park, God knows. So a lot of these guys didn't even get to the fleet, and they
Mm,
decided to crash themselves into
right.
whatever. I'm going to go out on a limb to presume that if this is indeed Ugaki in the cockpit of this aircraft, that he probably did get shot down by AAA, and that's why the thing landed on the water's edge right there.
Mhm. Well, there's evidence. I mean, didn't they find a poem in the cockpit? Isn't this the
No, they found
poetic
a
tool?
poem back home. Yeah, back
Oh,
home.
back
So
home.
back at
Wow.
Kyushu, Ugaki's diary that we refer to 1,000 times was gathered and prepared to be sent to his next of kin. A handwritten note, assumedly from Ugaki, was found in it that read, quote, "Having a dream, I will go up into the sky," unquote.
Mm.
And I'd just like to state that also in his memory, I composed this morning a farewell haiku that I would like to read here. Truculent Ugaki, final mission, a failure. Adieu, poetic tool.
Well done,
Thank
I
you.
like it.
Poetic
I like it.
historian.
Yes. Well, and the fact too that he explicitly says in his diary that it is never to be revealed or shared to the enemy, and that we end up getting our hands on it anyway and use it
Copy of it
as,
right back there.
yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Just further delights me that he would have been appalled that that diary ended up in our hands, and that we use it as it's a super important primary
Yes, it
source.
is.
But yeah, the fact that that would have just irked him just delights me. So
Yep.
anyway,
If you wonder why we hate on Ugaki so much, again, just go back and listen to some of the episodes that he's mentioning, which is a lot of them. I don't know which ones, but it's a lot. And pick up his book. What is it? Fading Victory?
fading
Fading
victory.
Victory. It's expensive if you can find it, but if you can find it, it's definitely worth your time to. Again, you're not going to get through cover to cover. It's not going to happen. But you can page through some of the important dates, and you get the idea as to why we consider him to be the poetic tool, because he never took any blame for anything that went
Yep.
wrong. He always threw people
Had
under the bus
fingers,
Mhm.
yeah, had fingers pointed at other people. Yeah, he's a great guy.
every time. Yeah, the guy could do no wrong. Well, got literally to the end, he could do no wrong.
Yep.
So,
Mhm.
well, gang, is there anything else you guys want to add to this? This is the final deliberations to the surrender.
Yeah. I guess that the last piece I would throw in is that there was a lot of monitoring after the surrender broadcast on the part of the Allies as to, okay, what's going on with the Japanese army units that are in places like China and Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of arm twisting that's happening on the part of people like Umezu when they're radioing to Kwangtung. There are some units out there like, we don't care. We're not gonna give up the ghost here. And it takes some arm twisting on the part of Tokyo to convince these cats that no, you are going to surrender because this is the will of the emperor. And eventually, though, what we end up getting out of the deal is a very smooth handoff of power. Not only we're going to do the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay next episode, but similar things end up happening all over the Pacific. In Singapore, in wherever. That the Japanese do end up laying down their arms, which is the first instance throughout this war that we've ever had an organized surrender of any Japanese unit. They just never did this. So
Mhm.
really dodged
You're
a
gonna
bullet there.
you're gonna big time. You're gonna see next week when we talk about, and next week's episode is not just about the surrender ceremony on the deck of the Missouri, but it largely is. But we're talking about boots on the ground, getting people ashore in Japan, and how quickly that happens. There was very real concern among the Americans who land in Japan. Are we going to be received with bullets, or are we going to be received with,
Acquiescence.
acquiescence, acceptance of these terms?
Yeah.
And there's a reason that the Marines land at the naval base, fully armed and ready to rock, because they did not know.
Mm-hmm.
Did not know. So that's another topic for another week.
Yes, indeed.
It is.
All right, guys. Are you good? Are we good?
We're good.
We're good. All right. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to send us a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And once again, I am woefully behind in my responses to the emails. Sorry, gang. I'm trying. We're getting there, but we'll do the best we can. So once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my friend, thank you very much for this particular episode above a lot of the ones here lately. You did a lot of the heavy lifting on this one, and it's much obliged.
No problem at all. No, it's absolutely fascinating week in Japanese history.
Indeed. All right, Bill, bring us home.
Will the war end for us next week? We'll see you again when we surrender next week.